Good morning, all. I would like to welcome you all for this glaucoma session 2. And chairing the session, we have Dr. Manish with us, and we have a great lineup of speakers. So I would request Manish to just give opening remarks, and then Dr. Purvi can start her talk. Dr. Manish.
So good morning, and I hope everybody is enjoying the scientific fest, and there's been a good level of discussion in the previous session, and I'm sure we'll carry it further. And we have very interesting talks today. So we'll start first with Dr. Purvi Bhagat from Ahmedabad, and she's going to talk to us about gonioscopy versus ASOCT and the finer points on that. Dr. Purvi, welcome, and you can start your talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Manish and Dr. Ragini Parekh and the MOS team for including me in this session. So I'll be talking on the comparative analysis between gonioscopy and anterior segment OCT. We all know that it is very, very important to diagnose glaucoma, and not only diagnose it rightly, but also to diagnose it very early so as to prevent the irreversible visual handicap that occurs with the disease. There is a lot of confusion regarding the diagnosis of glaucoma and its staging because there are a lot of parameters that are involved in the process. And if that is not enough, actually, we have a lot of other instruments and tools and equipments with us, which are simply focused on analysis of the anterior segment. And so the confusion increases. Charts of people with glaucoma in a large LA practice, in fact, showed that gonioscopy was documented only 50% of the time in the records, and therefore showing that that about half of the time it wasn't actually done and therefore not recorded. So why is this a lot of hesitation about doing gonioscopy? Much of the problems are regarding the technique. It definitely requires some skill and experience. It is a subjective evaluation. The results and interpretation are affected by the type of lens and technique that is used. It is uncomfortable, of course, for the patient being a contact procedure, but it is also uncomfortable for the ophthalmologist. All those who have been doing gonioscopy throughout the day, they know how the trapezius feels at the end of the day and evening. It is a little time consuming, cannot be done by a technician, so you always have to do it yourself, and being a contact procedure, it is not suitable for mass screenings. There are also issues regarding the interpretation. There is a lot of inter and intra-observer variability, which is more so with the occludable angles. Because it's a subjective direct visualization test, there is an inability to accurately document or compare the structures before and after treatment. Photographic documentation is not so easy. It is subject to different classifications, and there are indentation and light artifacts associated. And therefore, there is more and more trend of people to resort to the digital technology. Coming to the anterior segment OCT, it provides true cross sections. There is a significant amount of objectivity, and therefore there is reproducibility. It allows for quantitative measurements and which are greatly precise. Being a non-contact technique, it is convenient for the patient as well as the observer. And being a digital software-based technology, there is a scope of storage of the data and even transfer. Anterior segment OCT, we all know it allows rapid image acquisition and rapid measurement of all the parameters because of the automated software that it has. And being a non-contact technique, all those artifacts which are there with gonioscopy are not there with the ASOCT. An advancement in the ASOCT is the spectral domain OCT, which provides more images in a single pass, and it provides higher axial and transverse resolution. A step ahead is the swept source OCT, which provides a 3D 360-degree photographic-like view and which allows for reproducible measurements in different quadrants. And therefore, it is useful for the risk assessment of angle closure and for evaluating longitudinal changes and changes before and after treatment. There is a good inter and intra-observer agreement of the iridotrabecular index, which gives an extent of the angle closure that is existent. And because it's actually a 3D photographic view, it is useful for patient education and showing them the status of their own angles. Coming to clinical cases, when we see this, of course, clinically on slit lamp, the diagnosis is not very difficult, but you would always like to see what lies in the angles behind such steamy corneas. And so these are the cases where gonioscopy would not give you any information, but you may have to resort to an anterior segment OCT to actually see the status of the angles. Again, cases of angle closure, you have done a PI, you can very well see that it is patent. But when you do the gonioscopy, you are still very confused regarding the status of opening and how much is the width of the angle that has now occurred after the PI. Again, in case of angle closures, convex iris, you have done an intervention, it is a PI or it could be a lens extraction or whatever. You do a post-PI in a gonioscopy or a post-intervention gonioscopy. And again, still you are just sure whether it is open or closed or occludable, but you are not actually able to quantify the amount of success or change that has happened after the intervention. So in all these cases, ASOCT would be greatly helpful. Gonioscopy, again, we know it's a contact procedure, not very acceptable. Even we would not perhaps like a gonio lens easily to be put into our eyes. Well, ASOCT, on the other hand, it is a very sophisticated tool, non-contact. It makes life easier to some extent. What do the guidelines say about these two procedures? Gonioscopy is definitely essential, but it is qualitative and subjective, prone to variability between examiners. Imaging devices do provide a more objective assessment, and OCT has a greater sensitivity for identifying appositional angle closures. And of course, being a non-contact procedure, for screening, it is preferable. After all that is said and done, we coming back to gonioscopy. Yes, it is time consuming, but once you learn the art, it just takes less than a minute. It provides a quick 360-degree assessment of the angle width, with or without indentation, whereas OCT only measures a tiny fraction of the angle at one point of time. Again, it is not devoid of artifacts and difficulties. Scanning the superior and inferior quadrants can be challenging because of the eyelids. And subtle findings which are very, very important for the diagnosis and management of glaucoma, like goniosynechia, peripheral anterior synechia, pigmentation, patchy blotches of pigmentation, neovascularization, they cannot be picked up by the anterior segment OCT. OCT, yes, it detects more angle closure than glaucoma, but what does it mean? It just means perhaps more unnecessary PI. Plateau and pseudo-plateau iris, where you see this double hump sign on the gonioscopy, you would always want to see what lies behind the iris. Here, gonioscopy, of course, that does not tell you the information, but neither does ASOCT. And it is just as good as a gonio because it does not give you the resolution behind the iris. So for that to see the status of the ciliary body, the processes, the rotation, you would have to resort to a UBM. Quantification, yes, it is possible, but again, this requires a subjective input about the location of the scleral spur. So if your location of scleral spur is wrong, then all your parameter measurements would be incorrect. Longitudinal assessment, yes, it is possible, but again, you are unsure whether every time in the subsequent follow-ups, you are scanning the same area. So again, a measurement variability would still be there. ASOCT is operator dependent, so you have to just think whether you would rely on a report which is given by a technician or an operator, or whether you would like to see what and believe what you have seen with your own eyes. Being technology dependent, there is always an issue of systems crashing and software updates. And of course, there is no way you can compare the cost of an ASOCT with a gonio lens. So to conclude, gonioscopy is still the gold standard. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Anterior segment OCT is a great adjunct in selective cases, and especially in cases where a non-contact procedure is advisable, like post-operative, you want to follow up your immediate blebs and cases of trauma, but there's absolutely no substitute for a gonioscopy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Purvi, for that wonderful presentation. You very well emphasized the need for gonioscopy. ASOCT is not an alternative at all, and the limited situations wherein you can actually use this technology, that also you have highlighted very well. We would have question answers at the end of the session during the panel discussion. And now we move on to the next talk. It is by Dr. Nitin Deshpande, and he will be talking to us about MIGS with iStent. Dr. Nitin?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So my slides are visible.
Yeah, go to the slide. Yeah, it's visible now.
Yeah, so I will be talking about this new technology that is available now to us, is microincision glaucoma surgery with iStent from Glaucos, and I'll share with you my early learning experience. So we know that we have been having a lot of treatment options, and they have especially the drops, which where different pharma companies keep on adding to our options. And the other one is a laser trabeculoplasty, which is again a non-invasive modality that is available for mild to moderate glaucomas. However, the problems we face while prescribing medications is mostly the compliance of the patient. We know that by 6 months, only 53% patients are adherent to the medications that we prescribe. And we also know about ocular surface disorders that patients have to suffer, and then the amount of quality of life that patient's quality of life that suffers because of so many medications that they have to use. So those who are not controlled with medications or laser trabeculoplasty or laser surgeries, we move on to surgical options like traditional surgical option like a trabeculectomy and tube shunts. And with our experience, years of experience, we know that these modalities work really great. However, we reserve them for more of advanced glaucomas and for those patients in whom IOP is not controlled, even with maximum medical therapy, and glaucoma is progressive. And now with the entry of the new MIGS option from iStent, this option can be utilized for patients from mild to moderate glaucoma. And since this can be easily combined with a conventional phacoemulsification without adding much time to the procedure, this is going to be a viable option and a good new procedure in our armamentum for managing our glaucoma patients. Now, what is the goal of having a microincision glaucoma surgery is a simple ab interno approach, because we can combine it with our conventional phaco. You don't need any additional cut to do this. It is minimally traumatic because we are just putting it into the trabecular meshwork ab interno. It is efficacious because it consumes lesser time to perform it with no additional cuts on the eye. And it has a good safety profile, which has proven since almost 6 years follow-ups that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, and recovery is as rapid as our routine cataract surgery. Now, this is a first-generation iStent that is made recently available in India. It's a very micro device, and if you compare its size with the coin, it is a very, very small device made up of a surgical-grade titanium, which is safe even for a MRI, because even a recent publication in 21 regarding compatibility of iStent implanted eyes in a MRI, and it proved that it is very safe to do MRI in these patients without causing any artifacts or any harm to the eye. It is a heparin coated one, and it basically creates a patent opening in the trabecular meshwork. The trabecular meshwork is an area which we know is a source of 75% resistance to the aqueous outflow. Now, what are the indications? Generally, I would target it to start within my mild to moderate glaucoma patients, although there are publications in more advanced glaucomas also. Then I would prefer to do them in pseudophakic eyes and combine them with my cataract surgery. However, there have been publications in phakic eyes also. I would look for patients who are having difficulty taking medications, or those who have any ocular surface disorders, any other problems with the topical medications, or those who have a poor compliance to taking medications. Just make sure before you plan an iStent, do a good gonioscopy. So knowing your gonioscopy well and knowing your angle structures well is mandatory before you plan this surgery. And just rule out any synechiae or any rubiosis or any other angle anomalies before you plan this procedure. We know that medications which have BAK cause a lot of ocular surface disorder problems. Large percentage of our patients using topical medications have a OSD problem. And these definitely are the patients whom I would target so that we can reduce load of topical medications in these patients. Now, iStent spares conjunctiva is a major boon while using this procedure, because we have an intact and healthy conjunctiva in case we want to do any further surgical procedures in future. I'm sorry, my slide jumped. So this is one study which is a 3-year study from Newhan, which is published, which showed that for 3 years, IOP consistently stayed below 15 millimeters of mercury. And there was a significant reduction in number of drops used. So this was a 3-year study published in 2015 for this procedure. This was another study which showed a 6-year follow-up of 411 eyes. And it was done from mild, moderate to, and also in severe POAG patients. There was a significant reduction in IOP. There was a significant reduction in number of drops. And if you see, even in severe subgroup of severe glaucoma patients, there was a mean IOP reduction of more than 6 millimeters of mercury that sustained over 6 years, 6 years of post-operative period. Those eyes which had a higher IOP had a more robust reduction in IOP. And we know that we see the same thing even in our SLT patients, that when the IOP is high, we get a more drop after the procedure. And only a small percentage of patients had to undergo a secondary glaucoma procedure. Now, company has also launched a second generation. Oh, my device is. I'm sorry. Let me see. Oh. Sorry, my device is giving me trouble. I'm sorry. So this iStent versus the new generation iStent. This study compared iStent inject versus iStent, where IOP reduction was greater in iStent patients, and more number of patients in iStent inject had a pressure below 18 millimeters of mercury. Average medications drop was more with iStent inject patients, and 70% of patients in both groups were medication free. And if you see in the next slide, when you use more number of eye stents in one eye, you have more reduction in IOP. However, we have to also consider the cost factor while doing this. Now I'll just briefly talk about the eye stent surgical procedure. Although it looks easy, it has a good, it has a learning curve, and initially we need to look and start from working on our position. You have to tilt your microscope, position the patient's head away, so that when you're looking through the microscope, you're looking parallel to the iris into the angle. This takes a little while to get. I will performed recently. Sorry, yes. Sorry, I'm having some device malfunction.
Can you play the video directly?
Yeah.
Go out of. Yeah.
So this was a surgery that was combined with a cataract surgery, and I'll not dwell into the cataract part much. So after you implant the IOL, you have to go in with the high density visco. I have used a Hilon GV here. Now you fill it well. Also, you have to apply good amount of lubricant over the cornea so that you can unhindered view of the angle. So you get this direct gonio lens. It takes a little while to get used to it, but it's fairly simple. And I would suggest you start practicing that with your routine phaco cases before you actually go and do it in a iStent case. And you can see there is a blood reflex which is clearly visible. And post cataract surgery, generally you have a blood reflex in the Schlemm's canal. So identifying Schlemm's canal is not very difficult in post phaco cases. Then you have to enter the anterior chamber angle with the anterior chamber with the device, and be careful while coming in and out, because this device can easily get dislodged, and then you'll have to go and search for it. And see, you have to enter at an angle, and once you are in, just go parallel and just push the device in. And after you are inside the canal, just push it from the side so that you are sure that it is in place and that snorkel is facing you, is looking at you. You can see it is well placed now, and you can just see the body of the stent through the trabecular meshwork because it's a translucent structure. You just go to the next short video. This is second case. You can see my iStent is very well placed there, and snorkel is facing you. And when you're closing the case, you can see reflex of blood through the iStent that confirms that you are in a correct place. So I'll show you again. See the reflex here. You can see the blood is reflecting out of the iStent. I've closed the case. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry for the device malfunction, but I hope I was audible.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nitin, for that wonderful presentation. Next talk I would be presenting. So I'll start sharing my screen. Nitin, if you could please. So I'll be talking about releasable sutures and other options that we have. So I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, yes, visible. Go ahead.
Yeah. So trabeculotomy, in spite of the advent of MIGS that we've just seen, is still the gold standard and most commonly performed glaucoma surgery today in clinical practice for almost over 40 years now. It has evolved with times in the modifications in technique and then use of adjunctive metabolites mainly mitomycin C, and fairly associated with fairly good long-term success rates. So what we try to achieve while we do trabeculectomy is getting this diffuse low-lying posterior bleb in a quiet, well-formed anterior chamber and intraocular pressure in the range of low to mid-teens, which should be maintained on a long-term basis. And sometimes what we end up with is something like this, a large elevated bleb, a very shallow or even a flat AC, and the IOP, of course, very low. Why? Because you were not able to do that scleral flap suture properly. And this is what has happened over filtration and the subsequent complications. So this shallow or flat anterior chamber could land up into sequelae like peripheral anterior synecdoche and posterior synecdoche in the anterior chamber. The flat AC could lead to corneal endothelial decompensation and even cataract. In the posterior segment, you can have issues like choroidal effusion, macular edema, and even dreaded complications like suprachoroidal hemorrhage. So to prevent this early postoperative hypotony associated with oval filtration, what we need to do is intraoperatively titrate the outflow of the aqueous through the scleral flap by using tight scleral flap sutures. But we also don't want this flap to close down and the trabeculotomy getting failed. We would want to postoperatively gradually achieve reduction in the intraocular pressure, either by using releasable suture, one or more. Use, maybe if you have access to argon or diode laser, use laser suturolysis, or use something called as adjustable sutures. Laser suturolysis, you need to have access to either of these lasers. You can use you need to kind of compress the conjunctiva for you to be able to access that suture that you want to lyse. You use a specialized lens like Hoskins, or even a 4-mirror lens could be used. These are the argon settings, laser settings that you can use. The concerns related to laser suturolysis is because you are doing this in early postoperative period, the patient can have pain and discomfort. If there is a thick Tennant's capsule or subconjunctival hemorrhage, your visibility of the suture to be lysed won't be there properly. And inadvertent conjunctival buttonholing because of the laser energy also can occur. So this is the Hoskins lens that one can use. This is something which has been described by Professor Peng Kho using adjustable sutures. These are also releasable like sutures, but we don't externalize them. So basically we use slit knots like we will be using for releasable sutures, and then post-operatively you will want to adjust this suture, loosen this suture for having more aqueous flow transconjunctivally using a specially designed atraumatic forceps. And the concerns would be same as you would be having with laser suturolysis if you are not careful enough. So this is that atraumatic forceps which has blunt edges, which would prevent any conjunctival damage when you are wanting to adjust the sutures post-operatively. So coming on to releasable sutures, this is something which most of us can do. You can do tight scleral flap sutures using slip knots while you're closing the scleral flap. You can use one or more number of releasable sutures, and then post-operatively titrate and gradually achieve a reduction of IOP to the desired levels. So this is just to illustrate how we do it. You can take a corneal bite initially, then come out of the base of the scleral flap here, as you have come out here, and then you take your scleral flap sutures. This is basically a slip knot. Use 4 throws, tighten it adequately to make sure that the scleral flap suture is good. And then depending on how much the aqueous outflow is there, you can add one more interrupted suture or then go towards your conjunctival closure. I'll just try to share a video if it plays. Is the video visible? Is it running?
No, not.
It's not coming?
No, we can't see your video.
Just a moment. It's not coming still, is it?
No, it's not coming. You are sharing only your PowerPoint.
Okay, just a moment.
If you are trying to share the video directly, then close PowerPoint.
Is it coming now?
There's no video visible,
No.
and it just shows whether you want to save your changes to the presentation.
Okay. I think
Now
it's
share.
coming now. Yeah.
Now share your screen. Share your screen.
The screen sharing is turned off.
Just a moment. Sorry for that.
Yes, now we can.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. So I'll just go back a bit. So basically, we are taking a corneal, partial thickness corneal bite here, which will help in preventing windshield wiper syndrome post-operatively. The suture won't be loose ahead of the cornea. Then we would be
Video,
taking.
sorry, the video is still not working.
It's not playing still.
No. It's kind of a still image right now.
Not playing still.
No, it's not playing. We can't see anything. We're just a still image is there.
I think
Now it is playing. Now it is playing.
Okay, fine. So I have already taken that scleral flap bite at the base of the scleral flap, and then you are taking your scleral flap suture. So basically what you will be doing is, instead of taking a permanent bite closure, what you will do is taking something called as a slip knot. So for that you will use 4 throws and then tighten the suture to achieve good closure, tight closure of that scleral flap. So once you have done tightened it adequately, then you will cut the loose end and see the egress through the under the scleral flap. If you are comfortable enough, then you close the conjunctiva, or you can take one more additional suture here, a permanent one or a releasable one, and then you can close the conjunctiva. Is my PowerPoint showing now?
No, it's not showing. Your video is showing.
It's coming now?
Yes, it can be seen.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So when to release the sutures, nowadays, most of the cases we are using mitomycin C. So you can delay it a bit for even 2 to 4 weeks. If you're not using mitomycin, you can release the suture as early as a week. If your IOP control is adequate enough and you really don't need to release that suture, you can just trim it. So potential problem, well, once you are comfortable while with doing your procedure properly, the time is actually not an issue. Wrong suture placement, if you have taken a deep bite and it is a full thickness bite at the base of the scleral flap, after you release it, you can have a leak through there. If you, the exterior part of the suture, if it is loose, it can cause irritation and corneal epithelial defect resulting in infection. And there could be suture breakage and difficulty in exteriorizing the suture if your suture slip knot that is there gets entangled in the tenons. And early suture release can lead to excess filtration. So do we use it for all cases? Not really. In certain situations where you find that the indication is more, would be cases like angle closure glaucoma, where you don't want early postoperative hypotony and shallow AC. If there is a risk for aqueous misdirection, if the cornea is already compromised, if there is an early cataract, very advanced glaucoma, and you are wanting to do only trabeculectomy, and eyes where there is a risk of suprachoroidal hemorrhage, you would want to, and even risk of hypotony maculopathy, you would want to use these releasable sutures. To sum up, it is very important to prevent overfiltration and early postoperative hypotony, and releasable sutures is a useful tool to prevent this. You can utilize it to achieve gradual reduction of intraocular pressure to desired level postoperatively. Thank you so much.
Thank you for Ashish for your lovely talk. And I think next we have Dr. Gagan Singh, who is going to address the dilemma of normal tension glaucoma for us. Dr. Gagan.
Hi, Manish. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. Started. Cannot share my screen.
Yeah, just a
She's
moment.
still to unshare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have stopped sharing.
Yeah. So can you see my screen?
Not yet.
No, not yet.
Yes, we can see your screen now.
All right. So I'm going to talk about NTG, which is often a dilemma in our clinical practice. As we know that glaucoma is a complex disease, often challenging traditional theories on the causal relationship and causing NTG to be a baffling enigma. Is it as a separate diagnosis? It is often considered a distinction without a difference. It was first described in 1857 by von Graffe, now referred to as a clinical entity with two main elements having glaucomatous features plus a normal intraocular pressure. So is it a clinical entity or just a statistical entity? And we'll delve into that as we go along. And this is considered because probably the concept of NTG arose from misinterpretation of distribution of intraocular pressures. There are differences in the relative incidence of select features, but in any given patient, any of these features can be present. It's seen in the older age group, more frequent in Asia. Some studies have reported almost 50 to 90% of all glaucomatous cases, and other studies like the Rotterdam studies have shown less incidence in the white population of US and Europe. There are general risk factors of age, family, race, and gender. Ocular risk factors including myopia, disc hemorrhage, thin corneas, and systemic risk factors of hypertension, migraine, and vasospastic diseases. So what is the pathophysiology of NTG? Aging, as we know, is inclusive for all types of glaucomas, and all the other risk factors as we've seen, or the pathophysiological factors as we've seen, could be responsible for NTG in isolation or all contributing to each other. There can be IOP independent risk factors which predominate, like the vascular factors, or other pressures like the translaminar pressure difference. The role of intraocular pressure, the CNGTS study was the most influential study regarding the relationship between intraocular pressure and NTG. And it suggested that there is a definite role of IOP as a risk factor for progression, and IOP lowered the rate of progression from 35 to 12%, almost half the incidence. However, no clearly defined single intraocular pressure below which the eye is safe from progressive damage was notified. There are relative roles of pressure dependent and pressure independent mechanism across the spectrum of mostly all glaucomas, and especially normotension or low tension glaucomas. So is the pressure truly low? We have to look at the diurnal variability. We have to look at the nocturnal spikes. We have to see if there is any intermittent elevated episcleral venous pressures, or if there is any supine pressure elevation. We have to then look at the structural and the functional differences. There is a considerable overlap between glaucomatous changes between NTG and OAG, but statistical differences exist in NTG group. There are large discs with deep cups, prominent disc notching, prominent peripapillary or parapapillary atrophy, frequent disc hemorrhages. if we look at there probably is evidence of thin structural layers like the lamina cribrosa in this subset of patients. Higher prevalence of disc hemorrhages, which is a strong predictor of rapid progression. IOP lowering can help to halt the progression after disc hemorrhages. Recurrent disc hemorrhage are also common, and these tend to occur often close to the initial disc hemorrhages. These rebleeds tend to have significantly lower IOP, and one needs to step up the treatment for intraocular pressure lowering. Beta peripapillary or parapapillary zone is also seen more commonly in NTG patients. This is larger in eyes with disc hemorrhages and may be an early sign of progression. Field effects are noted as dense paracentral visual field effects, which are deeper and closer to fixation, and often a 10-2 rather than a 30 or a 24-2 may be more helpful in localizing these. Superior defects are more common because of inferior temporal lamina cribrosa, which is more susceptible to initial damage. And having looked at all this, we could see that whether the NTG has other pressures acting on it, like a lower CSF or a higher translaminar pressure difference. We've not reached a conclusive stage where studies are concerned, and we may hear more about these in the future. Yes, there are genetic predispositions, mutations in the optineurin and the tank binding kinase 1 genes have been localized. These are proteins involved in the autophagy proteins. So are the nerves more susceptible? Is IOP the cause, or is it the gene? So if we answer these questions, we can thereby look at future treatments which will target both pressure dependent and independent pathways. Mainstream treatment for NTG is still pressure reduction. We need to measure the initial baseline pressures, closely observe patients with mild visual field loss prior to initiation of treatment. The LOGIT study and the CNGTS study both have showed encouraging results based on the topical drugs like brimonidine, which can have an IOP independent favorable action on the neural cell. But most studies are needed for validation of these results. So we need to take special care in those patients which have worse visual acuity or more advanced field loss at diagnosis, because the 20-year estimation of NTG patients can lead to unilateral blindness in about 10% of patients. So strategies looking beyond pressures in recent years have also been looked upon, like calcium channel blockers, ginkgo biloba, citicoline, etc. And these are not to replace, but to complement the intraocular pressure lowering approach. So it's not just about intraocular pressure, but it's the individual variation in susceptibility for those particular patients which have continued damage at lower pressures. We still need to fully understand all the causal and protective factors and differentiate NTG from POAG using genetics, biomechanics, and evaluations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gagan, for that lucid presentation. We move on to the next talk now. Dr. Sunil Jain would be speaking to us about managing leaking trabeculectomy blebs. Sunil, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Dr.
Just waiting
Gagan,
for
please
Gagan
stop
to
sharing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Good afternoon.
yes, Sunil, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, and thank you, MOS, Manish, and Dr. Ragini for having me here. I'll be talking about leaking trabeculectomy blebs. So first, we need to differentiate. There's a difference between a wound leak and a bleb leak. A wound leak is a leak occurring along the conjunctival closure line. Okay, and whenever you finish closing your conjunctiva, you should always have do a meticulous search to rule out a wound leak. And it's most common in the first week, and it can present despite an acceptable IOP. Yeah, so this is just to show you what a wound leak could occur. This is the conjunctival line of closure. And as you can see, there's a wound gape out here. And with Cedars, you can test it. It's a very small leak, not causing any significant AC shallowing or something, but just to differentiate what a wound leak looks like. Now coming to bleb leak, it's a leak which occurs over the surface of the bleb, and it's actually more problematic and quite difficult to treat surgically as compared to a wound leak. A wound leak can be easily sutured immediately, but a bleb leak is over the surface and it's very difficult to suture it out. Now, when does it occur? It can occur in the immediate postoperative period, especially when you intraoperatively you unknowingly have a conjunctival buttonhole and you've already used mitomycin, and that wound obviously won't heal. Or it can present in the late postoperative period because of the continuous conjunctival thinning post mitomycin C usage or any antifibrotic usage. Now, it's a very serious and a vision-threatening complication whenever it occurs, and it can occur months to or even years later. And this is how you can see how a trabeculectomy bleb keeps on thinning over a period of years. And as the patient ages, the conjunctiva also thins further and results in cystic bleb, which ultimately will thin out and lead into a bleb leak. Late bleb leaks usually were more common in the earlier days because of full thickness procedures being used. But with the use of antimetabolites in almost every patient of trabeculectomy in the present scenario, it's quite common in the late phase also. So how do you suspect a bleb leak? Majority of the times, it's just an incidental finding, but always suspect when on follow-up of the patient, you suddenly feel a significant drop in IOP as compared to the previous visit. So if the pressures are remaining at 10 or 12 and all post-trabeculectomy, and suddenly the pressure comes to about 2, 3, 5 or something, we should always suspect a bleb leak. Secondly, if the patient suddenly starts complaining of unilateral tearing, that is of the tearing of the eye from which the trabeculectomy has been performed. And hence, always, whenever you do an intraocular pressure measurement, the Cedars test has to be done, and always lift the upper lid and evaluate the bleb also. So the incidence of late bleb leaks has been in the range of about 1.8 to 10% with the use of antifibrotic agents. Apart from the antimitotic agents which are used, there's a sign of a scleral fistula which usually is seen, okay, which could be adding to a direct gush of the aqueous to the roof of the conjunctiva, and this causes localized scleral fistula, and this results in a localized conjunctival thinning and predisposes to a bleb leak. So what is the cause of this scleral fistula? It's a wound construction, and important steps which have to be followed during wound construction. Avoid shelving at the edges of the scleral incision. So whenever you make a scleral incision, it has to be a uniplanar, gradually moving your blade from one edge to the other edge in a uniform pattern and maintaining a uniform thickness of the scleral flap. If anytime you have shelving of the edge of the thing, where the one edge is very thin, it can be prone to a scleral fistula. Then handling your flap with a tooth forceps. Okay, a tooth forceps might cause a buttonhole of the a scleral flap, and this might result in a full thickness drainage. A tear or a buttonhole or partial amputation of the scleral flap, especially more towards the limbal, because that's where you tend to become a bit more superficial, and the scleral flap might thin out and result in a kind of amputation or partial amputation of the scleral flap. Also, extensive cautery of the sclera will cause shrinkage of the scleral flap edge, and it is difficult to reapproximate the scleral flap, and that's when this can be prone to a scleral fistula developing later in the future. Symptoms at presentation, as I told you, most of them are asymptomatic, but sometimes you could have a watering, and as you can see, a transparent tear film across the cornea. It's like a waterfall which is happening. So every time you watch, you need not do a Cedars, but obviously Cedars will make it more prominent. But when you see this kind of a tear film falling across the cornea, always suspect a bleb leak. Rarely patients present to you with pain and blurring of vision. And again, blebitis is very common with endophthalmitis. Okay, if the bleb leak is untreated, you will have these serious complications: endophthalmitis, shallow chamber, peripheral anterior synechial formation, hypotony, folds, and all. So always the protocol is conservative as a first line of treatment. It's a very small leak. You can do patching. You can add topical aminoglycosides like gentamicin. Systemic aqueous suppressants will reduce the aqueous production, and hence less aqueous will pass through the wound leak. Bleb leak. And if that does not serve the purpose, you can think of a cyanoacrylate glue application with the insertion of bandage contact lens. And even if that does not help, then a surgical revision. So this is just to show you a few patients. This is a patient with just a surface leak, as you can see, thinning out here, and CDUS positive here. It gradually increases. This patient was treated with topical gentamicin, tobramycin ointment, and systemic carbonic anhydrous, and it usually resolved. This is one more patient who had a scleral fistula, and if you can see, the limbal edge was leaking. Again, he was responded very well to conservative management, but obviously the patient has to be made to be aware of this persistent leakage. It can have recurrent, and if any redness happens, he has to follow up immediately with you. All this, there is the same patient with a scleral fistula with a leakage. As you can see, the leakage has completely healed. This is just by conservative management. But obviously, you have to keep a watch on these patients. The important counseling point post-trabeculectomy is always avoid direct splashing of water, because most of these blebs become thin, and water being contaminated, these patients are then prone to blebitis and bleb leaks. Avoid excess rubbing of eyes, especially in those with cystic thin blebs. Watch for unilateral watering. Any redness, discharge, decrease in vision, please report to an ophthalmologist rather than to a general physician. Okay, because they tend to give steroids, and which could add to the complications. So when would you think about a surgical bleb revision? When there's a vision threatening complications such as flat chamber, blebitis, recurrent bleb leaks. And this was a patient, Axenfeld-Rieger syndrome, and she had a continuous small leak here, as you can see here. Okay, we tried our medical line of treatment, conservative. However, it does not respond. So then we put in a cyanoacrylate glue. The problem is you have to put a bandage contact lens, because this irritates, it becomes hardened, and it irritates the eye. However, in spite of that, the leak persisted, and ultimately we had to do a surgery. The surgical modalities are, if you have a very small leak and a small bleb, all you have to do is cut the conjunctiva behind it, okay, undermine it, and pull the conjunctival flap, the conjunctival advancement, and suture it. Okay, the relaxing incision may or may not be sutured depending on the size of the relaxing incision. But if it's a very large bleb and a thin cystic bleb, you might have to do a conjunctival excision and a conjunctival advancement. So this is just a small video just to show you. This was a large bleb. There was a scleral fistula here. We did a conjunctival peritomy first, all around, and then ultimately we excised this bleb. And as you can see, whenever you excise the bleb, be careful of the underneath the sclera, because that will be very thin and the scleral flap may not be visualized. You have to be very careful. Here you can see the scleral fistula. A paracentesis is done, because in the hypotony it's usually difficult to do a paracentesis. Air bubble is injected. Okay, so that this gives some rigidity to the globe when you want to do a scleral flap dissection. A scleral partial thickness scleral flap is dissected. And then this flap basically, okay, the base is towards the fistula. You just clean up both the surfaces and then rotate the scleral flap. So this is the autologous graft which we are putting over the scleral fistula, so that if a persistent scleral fistula will always cause a recurrent bleb leak. So you have to kind of seal the scleral fistula with the graft. And then ultimately you do conjunctival advancement and suture it. Whatever friable tissues are there, just clean it up. And then with conjunctival advancement, suture it. Postoperatively, we continue with antibiotic steroid medications, and this is what in the immediate postoperative, initially the bleb appears quite vascular, but over a period of time it settles down and the bleb remains well formed. So in conclusion, basically a presence of underlying scleral fistula is a risk factor and a sign of impending bleb leak, and should be watched for bleb leaks in the future. Partial thickness scleral tissue used as a patch graft is effective in repairing excessive draining fistulas. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil, for that excellent presentation. So the last talk for this session is by Dr. Rajul Parekh. He would be talking to us on immediate post-op complications and management. Rajul, please start your talk.
Thanks, Ashish. I'd like to thank MOS, Dr. Agini ma'am, Manish for inviting. So I'll be talking about immediate post-operative complication. Now, already we have discussed that, how the perfect bleb should be. So I'm not going to talk about it. There are certain pre-operative precautions. It's very important because that reduces the intraoperative and post-operative complications. Again, I'm not going to go detail, but we have to take care, and we can discuss this later on if you have time. So complications can be divided into pre-intraoperative and post-operative. So I'll be talking about early post-operative complications. Now, this is how you can classify. It can happen at high intraocular pressure, low intraocular pressure, or IOP independent. So let's start with the minor complications which are IOP independent, like hyphema. Now, usually it can happen because of the intraoperative complication. If you have a iris bleed or inadvertently you have damaged the ciliary body while doing the iridectomy. Now, usually conservative, we wait and watch. Usually is absorbed within few weeks. Unless it's total hyphema or near total hyphema, it does not require washout. But yeah, you have to increase the steroid because it increases the inflammation and that reduces the success rate. The uveitis is again aggressive steroid, sometimes systemic, but usually topical, and a strong cycloplegic like atropine helps. So this is the IOP independent early complications. Now let's go to the low IOP, and some of the complications Sunil has already mentioned. So I'm not going to talk about detail about the leak part, but I have to go. So the first is the in relation to the bleb is formed. So what are the causes? If the bleb is formed and IOP is low, then usually it's overfiltration. The overfiltration can be because of the loose scleral flap. Now, usually we start with conservative. So the strong cycloplegic, because atropine pushes the lens iris diaphragm backward. If it's overfiltering, you can reduce the topical steroid. Some cases, aqueous suppression may be useful. The gentamicin, because it invokes the conjunctival inflammation, can be used. The otherwise, the torpedo patch, pressure patch, or the oversized contact lens that can be used in the overfiltering bleb. But we have to remember that prolonged anterior shallow AC reduces the success rate. So we have to do certain surgical intervention. So like the high viscoelastic molecule, Helon or equivalent, or if the AC is shallow or flat, then we have to do surgical revision. And if you're doing surgical revision, you have to see that if the scleral flap is loose sutures, then it requires suturing. Now, why it's important? Because the overfiltering bleb can lead to the hypotenuse maculopathy. It can cause choroidals. Of course, choroidals and the overfiltration is both phenomena, because if the choroidals also can lead to the hypotony, and hypotony can lead to choroidals. So we have to look into it. Now, how to prevent? So when you're doing surgery, you have to remember that the eye, which is high myope, pigmentary glaucoma, post-vitrectomized eye, or low scleral rigidity, a high risk for overfiltration, and of course the high concentration of antimetabolites like mitomycin. So in this kind of eyes, it's better to use tight flap closures, and we can always do the IOP titration by scleral flap releasable. Already Ashish has discussed in great detail, so we can use that. Thin flap is again the risk factor even in the normal eyes, so the thin flap should be avoided. Releasable should not be removed immediate post-operative unless pressure is too high, and at a time one releasable or one suture removal in a step-by manner. If the bleb is overfiltering, what is described is cryotherapy, the grid laser around the overfiltering bleb, autologous blood injection, and compression suture. I usually prefer compression suture if necessary. Most of the time, conservative management is adequate. Then we go to the wound leak. The bleb leak, Sunil has discussed in great detail, so I'm not going to talk about it. But the site of leak is important. What amount of leak is important, as Sunil has discussed. The risk of blebitis endophthalmitis increases, so we have to be take great care. The Sunil has discussed the management in great detail, but small leaks, conservative management, large leak required surgical intervention. The small leaks, we can the paired contact lens, large diameter contact lens. If the patient has membrane gland dysfunction, then the systemic doxycycline tablet also helps because it reduces the inflammation and improves the healing. Another complications in low IOP is choroidal effusion. Now, choroidal effusion, as I mentioned, it is a vicious cycle. The low IOP can cause choroidal effusion causes low IOP. So it's a never, it's just continuous going process. So we have to remember that choroidal effusion has to be taken care properly and in early post-operative period. Now we have to see that how much amount of IOP the patient has. If the patient has choroidal effusion, whether antechamber is shallow or deep, and how to take care of. Now the most important thing is that what is the cause. So if there is a wound leak, we have to take care of the wound leak. If the loose flap, sterile flap, then of course we have to go back and take the flap suturing. The high viscoelastic material in antechamber forms the antechamber. It of course temporarily increase intraocular pressure also. So in some cases it may be helpful if the patient has a very large choroidals like flat antechamber because of the choroidal effusion causes lenticular corneal touch, kissing choroidals, progressive corneal edema, or more than 8 days. So these require choroidal drainage. Now I have a small video, but in time of view, I will not run the video. We'll go to the other complications. So hypotony, this is how you follow. Type of surgery. Of course, we are talking about TRAP, so I will not go about the tube. Patient is Riddle positive or no. If the patient is Riddle positive, so let's discuss. If the patient doesn't have Riddle is negative, then look for the overfiltration and look for the formation of antechamber. If it's flat, then requires reformation, viscoelastic, maybe compression suture. If the antechamber is formed, then we can start with conservative, and later on, if it doesn't form or if patient doesn't improve, then we have to go for the surgical intervention. The other is the low intraocular pressure, the serially body shutdown, cleft detachment. Now, serially body shutdown basically is because of the excessive inflammation. They will improve with the intensive topical steroid, sometimes systemic steroid, strong cycloplegic like atropine. If you, for whatever reason, if you have given topical anti-glaucoma ocular hypertensive medication, please stop it. Now, cyclodialysis cleft is rare complications of post-trabeculectomy. The UBM is the ideal way of diagnosis, but in early postoperative period, if you are worried, a gonioscopy also would give you an indication of cleft. The small cleft usually resolves with the atropine. You can reduce the steroid. If the cleft is large, if the hypotony persists for longer time, then you have to do a surgical repair. If the post-operatively patient has high IOP, then it depends. If the antechamber is flat, then is most probably malignant glaucoma. The malignant glaucoma usually would require medical management like IV mannitol, strong cycloplegic, or acetazolamide. If it's successful, then it's good enough. Then patient is pseudophakic, then hyalodotomy, otherwise pars-plana vitrectomy. And if the IOP is normal or high and antechamber is formed, there can be a suprachoroidal hemorrhage. The B-scan is the way to diagnose. Now, suprachoroidal hemorrhage has to be managed in consultation with a VR surgeon. So to conclude, careful preoperative planning is very important in managing immediate postoperative complication. The meticulous surgical technique reduces your immediate and late postoperative complications, and a frequent follow-up is very important in post-trabeculectomy or any glaucoma surgery. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajul, for covering such an exhaustive topic in such a short time. I think we hardly have any time for discussion. Maybe we take a question or two and then hand over the session to the next moderators and chairperson. There is a question for Dr. Nitin. Would you recommend doing iStent as an independent or primary procedure without combining it with cataract surgery?
Yes, there have been a lot of publications with iStents done in phakic eyes. But to start with, I would prefer to do it with the phaco, because once you remove lens, your angle deepens up and visualization.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any other comment that anybody would like to make, or Dr. Manish?
I think we are running quite late. We have to hand over the session to the next because we were given the session in time. So I think we should close the session here.
Sure. So thank you.
Thank you
so much to each speaker, and thank you MOS for the opportunity. And we call this session to close and hand it over to the moderator for the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.